Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and this week I made death.
Hello.
Now this isn't going to be your bog standard Grim Reaper who wanders around like a semi-spooky skeleton with a scythe. No, I want to make this version a little bit different in that his body will be a big ethereal robe floating above the ground, held up by the scythe. So I guess he's going to be a spooky semi-skeleton with a scythe. So to make the shaft of the scythe, I'm going to use the thickest gauge armature wire I have. I'm stealing this idea from those floating Yodas that seem to flock to British cities in the summer. Ideally, I'd use the thickest wire the entire way through, but I want to make Death's arms bony, so I need to make some thinner wire, otherwise he's going to be hella thick. With a thinner wire wound around the shaft, I can then prop it up in my freshly duct taped block and begin the enwoodening process. I can then start to blend the seams together and add some much needed gnarly wood texturing by aggressively brushing the surface with a stiff nylon brush. I'll then poke some knots into some of the thicker sections, add some final thicker cuts, then bake it in the oven. Once it's been baked, I can cut the tip off and remove the unnecessary wire at the top. Instead, I figured it'd be easier to make the metal bit of the scythe removable so I can paint it separately later. To do this, I'll lay the shaft on a sheet of paper and draw a rough outline for the size and shape of my scythe. I'll then transfer this shape onto a sheet of sculpting mesh and cut that to size. I can then take this mesh blade and press it onto a thin sheet of Super Sculpey before sandwiching it between a second sheet and cutting it to size using the original paper template as a guide. Once it's been baked in the oven, I can pry it off the baking tray and start to shape the shape of the scythe into something more shapely. I'll use a sharp scalpel to sharpen the blade and refine the finer shape of the curve before cracking out a couple sheets of sandpaper to smooth the surface out and remove any of the glaring imperfections. I can then re-add those imperfections by cutting gouges and nicks into the blade. I figure the Grim Reaper's been hard at work for years and somewhere along the way realized that a rusty chipped blade works just as well as a shiny new one when it comes to reaping souls. To attach the blade to the shaft, I'll wrap the tip of the shaft in a slab of clay and shape it into a relatively appropriate shape, then stick my freshly chipped blade into the middle. A little blending will keep the blade attached to the shafty bit, and a little hammering with a ball stylus will add some hand-hammered texture. Finally, a couple rivets to hold it all in place, and I can wrap the shaft in a thin strip of linen, then it's into the oven for a final bake, and that's my gnarly, knotted, rusty scythe finished. I can then remove the metal bit from the shaft and set that aside while I get to work making my bony bits. I want my arms to be bones, but the forearm is made up of two bones side by side, so I'll carefully unwind my wound wire to make my Grim Reaper's radius and ulna. I'll then wrap the tip of the arm in a little lump of white clay and add some tiny bony wormy dealies that will be my tiny bony fingers. The arm bones can then get wrapped in their own layer of clay, and a little poking and prodding will add the necessary bony texturing. To make the other arm, I need to wrap some more wire around the first wire since I didn't leave myself enough to start with. I also realized that at this point he's a bit wobbly, which will make the sculpting rather annoying, so I've added a length of wire that reaches down to the base for extra support. Otherwise, I can start the emboning process on the other arm in much the same fashion as the first. This time I pre-baked my fingers in the oven since I want them pointing at an unseen victim off in the distance. By pre-baking them, I can ensure the position and shape prior to attaching them to the wrist. With that though, my bony appendages are all finished, which means it's time to make a skull. I'll start with a little ball of Super Sculpey that I can reshape into a roughly shaped shape. I can then cut off the sides to make the jawline, then poke some divots into the front of the face to make the eye sockets, followed by the nose holes. After a little facial refining, I can cut out the zygomatic process and begin building up the zygomatic bone with some Cosclay. I've built up the body of the skull with Super Sculpey since it's nice and firm and it should hold its shape while I'm handling it, and any additional smaller parts are made of Cosclay since that generally is easier to blend and it's more flexible once it's been baked. Otherwise, once I've thickened up the mouth, I can cut a line down the middle to separate my upper and lower jaw before poking lots of little teeth into the surface. A tiny curved tool will help refine the shape and give me a good toothy look. Now at this point his head was a little too short, so I'll thicken up the top with some more clay pressed on top and blend it in, and that's pretty much my skull finished. A little pokey pokey with a soft nylon brush will add a little bony texturing, and it's into the oven to bake. Last but not least, I'll use the sharp stabby part of my sculpting tool to carve the little sutures into the sides and top of the skull, as well as add some of the little fractures along the front. And with that, Death's head is done and ready to be attached to the body. His head fits neatly onto the little length of exposed wire, and I'm ready to robe this bad boy up. Except, it's not quite right. In my mind's eye, I envisioned the Grim Reaper looking down from on high, pointing at you all spooky-like with long, billowy robes. That's not really a problem, since I can just pull this guy up and out and have the tips of the robes trailing on the ground, hiding the supporting wires inside the folds. No, the problem is that my oven is tiny, and if I make him any bigger, he won't fit inside. Fortunately, I have a solution. I just remade a skull and scythe at a much smaller scale. They are functionally identical, but because they're much smaller, I can make his body bigger while not actually being any bigger. Alas, poor Yorick, mine head was too large. So now what I need to do is remake my body, but with a more flowy, floor-touching robe in mind. Since his scythe is no longer going to be holding him aloft, I need to make a stable enough base using the least amount of wire possible. Strictly speaking, a tripod is always more stable than a quadpod, since it's never actually going to be wobbly. My plan then is to have the robe be extra tattered with 3 long strips reaching down to the ground, holding the wire within. At the moment I've got sort of a windswept wire look going with robes trailing on the ground, but I'll scrap that later for a just the tip approach. Otherwise, I've attached the wire for the limbs and I can begin the re-emboning process. I'll also take this opportunity to add a bit more detail onto those knuckle bones. Now, before I just slapped a couple fingers on and called it finished, but if my knuckles are looking gnarly, then I really ought to spend a bit more time getting the fingies right too. I'll start by sectioning out 5 roughly equal little lumps of clay that I can then gently roll into little white bony sausages. Then using the rounded tip of my sculpting tool, I can roll back and forth to create the lumpy knuckles on each finger before coming back with a sharper clay shaper to once again roll the fingers and create each of my bony segments. This whole process then leaves me with some pretty excellent teeny tiny bony fingies. I can then stick them onto the staff, wrapping around the shaft. For the other hand, I'll do the same as I did before, pre-baking before pressing them into place, but this time I'll keep the fingers separate and attach them one by one. Finally, because the bone of the arm is much thinner this time, I'm going to coat the armatures in some liquid clay, which will harden around the wire once it's been baked. All that's left to do then is paint the bony bits with a unifying white base coat, and I can finally get started making the robes. I'm going to build up the robes in several stages, starting with a dome at the top. I want to keep the weight to a minimum, so I'm going to build up a frame out of aluminum foil that I can then drape a super thin sheet of Cosclay on top of. This will keep it from sinking between the gaps of the wire, and once it's been baked, it'll form the upper body of the robe. Now with the upper portion hardened, I can begin attaching the long drapey bits down the sides. All of this is done with Cosclay, since the thinner Cosclay is rolled, the more flexible it becomes once it's baked. I think if you tried to do this with more traditional oven-baked clay, you'd have a bad time. As it stands though, this was surprisingly easy to do and one of the more enjoyable things I've sculpted in a while. I always like sculpting fabric, and given that this model is like 90% fabric, I'm having a pretty good time. Once I've got the drapey bits that hide the wires finished, I can start to add the shorter bits that hang down alongside them, as well as begin to add the torn and ripped texturing. This is most easily done by literally tearing the clay with a pair of flat tweezers. This clay has a bit of stretch to it, so by pulling at the edge you can create some pretty realistic torn fabric. With the drapey side bits done, it's time to add his arms. I like the idea of him being super hunched over, but I need to build up the clay around the shoulders since the wire for his arms just sorta extends straight into his body. Once I've added some thicker sausages and blended them in, I can drape some more sheets over the top to create the robe's arms before moving on to adding his big spooky hood. I'll drape this over his head and blend it back into his upper body before pulling and tearing the fabric so it hangs in a natural, albeit spooky way. Finally, one final sheet over the upper half will add some more thickness to his upper body, as well as cover any of the obvious joins and seams from adding the rest of the robes. A little last wrinkling with some clay shapers, and that's my floaty Grim Reaper finished. All he needs now then is a tiny bit of color to highlight the spookiness. I'll tape off the white bony bits as well as his scythe, since I plan to do the majority of the painting with my airbrush. I'll start by giving the entirety of his robes a once-over with a unifying black base coat. Now, one of my patrons said I should have done this in a black 4.0, but I'm pretty sure Boylei Hobby Time purchased every bottle available, so sadly I don't have any. What I do have, though, is some light blue ink that I'll apply to the lower portion of the robes to create a sort of ethereal gradient that I think works well for making this spooky floaty boy a little bit spookier and floatier. I'll then follow this up with just a baby's breath of white ink to add that last little bit of frosty highlighting. Finally, I want to get rid of as much shine as possible, so I'm going to give the entire model a once-over with an ultra matte varnish. I know it's shiny right now, but once it dries, it should be pretty much totally flat. See? No shine at all. Otherwise, once the painter's tape's removed, I can paint the shaft with a darker dark red wood wash and then tint the linen with a little khaki colored wash. I'll then paint all the bony bits with a strong beigey bone white wash, and while that dries, I'll add some highlights and textures to the scythe by adding lighter shades on the linen and a lighter brown dry brush on the shaft. Back to the bones, I can dry brush a couple coats of progressively lighter bone white whites to bring back that semi-bleached look before painting the inside of the eyes with a flat matte black. To give the scythe a metallic look, I'll paint the scythe with some metallic paints. I'll start with a base coat of duraluminum and follow that up with a coat of duraluminum tinted with umber ink. Once that's dried, a generous black wash will help to bring out all the nicks and gouges. Finally, I decided a while ago that I wanted this scythe to be extra rusty, so I'll apply a liberal amount of dirtied down rust. I find the trick with this stuff is to apply it nice and thick, then once it's dried, come back with a wet brush to push it around to create some lovely rusty gradients. Then I can attach my scythe to my shaft, and that's my Grim Reaper finished. Now, I had considered calling it good here, but then I had a great idea for a base. To make my base, I'm going to need a couple equally sized circles of foam, which I think should be exactly the same size as this well-loved round baking tray. So once I've cut some sheets to size and traced my tray, I've got a couple perfect circles ready to be snapped apart. I'll then taper the broken edge so I've got a bit of a ramp and I can glue my two pieces together. And once the glue's set, I can cover the entire base in a layer of fake mud. This particular mix is a pot of wood filler I found while cleaning my studio. Now, half the base is going to be a shallow river, so I'll cover the lower portion of the base in lots of little rocks to create a riverbed. Once everything's been cured, I can prime it black, then follow that up with a coat of dirty dirt-colored paint. Finally, to make the rocks stand out a tiny bit more, I'll gently sponge a couple coats of orangey and yellowy browns haphazardly over the top. I'm going to be pouring resin, so I need to make a dam around the lower edge, which I'll make by gluing a strip of peel and stick veneer to the rim. The peel and stick is smooth enough that it won't impart any texture to the resin, and the wood is sturdy enough that it won't give way under the heat or the weight of the resin. Finally, since I don't trust the hot glue anymore, I'll seal the edge with a bead of UV resin. Otherwise, with my muddy riverbed finished, it's time to mix up my water. A couple drops of green and blue coloring will tint my water to a lovely bluish green, and I can start to pour it onto the riverbed. This will cure in roughly 24 hours, but before it fully sets, I want to add a couple bits and bobs to the water. First, I made a couple reeds to liven up the place a bit by sticking a bunch of bristles together with UV resin. I'll stick them into the water around the water's edge and add some wire to keep them from toppling over as the resin sets. Additionally, I'll add a little scatter leaves to the water since it's a lively river after all. Next, I need to make a patch of ice, which I'll make out of this little sheet of perspex. I'll trace a little circle into the center using my circle cutter, then haphazardly snap it into lots of little pieces. Then I'll glue these pieces onto another ugly acrylic circle using super glue. Normally you want to avoid super glue since it tends to cloud up and stain acrylic, but that's actually perfect since it's going to be a little chunk of ice anyways. Then it's time for more snapping. And more gluing. Finally, a quick sanding with a low grit sandpaper, and I've got a lovely little icy circle ready to be dropped onto my river. Of course, if I drop it in now, it'll just sink to the bottom, so I'm going to attach a little acrylic rod to the center and use some helper hands to hold it in place while the resin cures. 24 hours later, my resin is rock hard, so I can remove the various support pieces from my floating bits and bobs and free the base from its veneer prison. The water's a touch too smooth, so I'll add some ripples and waves on top with some Vallejo water effects, then I can cover the watery bits with a dome of aluminium and paint the muddy dry bit with a heavy coat of thinned down PVA glue. This glue will be the base into which I apply my first layer of static grass. This first layer is only 3 millimeters tall, but it makes a nice thick base that I can then build my next layer of much longer 12 millimeter grass on top of. Once the glue is dried, I can remove the aluminium covering and add some frosting to the ice using my airbrush. I'll also frost up some of the grass where death will be standing before going back to the ice and adding some final cracks and highlights with some bright white. Now I could stop here, but I've got a little bottle of salt water I've been dying to try out. This is Liquid Frost from Green Stuff World, and it's a heavy saline solution that, as it dries, creates tiny salt deposits that look just like frost. Apparently, I've never used it before, so join me on this salty saline adventure and let's find out together. I'll apply it through the airbrush over the icy bits, as well as heavily into the center of the grass, gradually spiraling outwards. Then I'll leave it for several hours and come back to this, which admittedly is kinda awesome. I need to figure out the best way to apply it, but I can definitely see myself using this in lots of little projects here and there. I sprayed it on the scythe as well to mixed results. It leached the color out of the rust, so now my blade looks like it has a spooky fungal growth, which is kind of okay too. Otherwise, I can pop death in place on his frosty base, and that's us done here and onto the Glamour Shots. As always, a big ol' thank you to my wonderful patrons, and a special hey how are you to my newest patrons. Henry is my best buddo, Jack-O-Lantern, Nellie-Ann Viebenstad, Callie, Hi DD, T Dolan, Annie Rexick, Gaunt Paladin 4, Paige, Pancaked Panda, Sarah Rye, Katie Parsons, Morgan Mac Kaysen, Matt Clark, Elizabeth Fetos, Use That Egg, Shelby, Monsters Are Real, Tommy and Jack, Simeon Gonad, Unbelievable, Crit Craft, Mono Die, Kirsten, Acidic Ash, CC, Cynical and Salty, Mark Mouvet, Jesus Christ, Marissa Amundsen, Indiana Eero and Sawyer, Rory the Devil's Bud Challenor, Muffed Movies, Rowena Randall Piercy, Mustache Man, Dimitri, Yanni Painter, Sarah Moody, Hyacinth Piccadilly Onyx, Nat Wills, God's Most Special Little Boy, Lackey M, Louisa Ann Hartnell, Alexa Joe Gilbert, Hope, Kale Chip, Ben McAdam, Jordan Tomlinson, Lindsay O'Connell, Supersonic Racing, Owen Burris, Alex Selkowitz, Hayden and Eveline, Fran of House Awesome, Peanut Dreams, Sunder, Carla's Face Paint, Miss Vesta, Pyroid Eye, Jackie Killian, Wendy, Doyers, Emily Goatman, and Meat Farts. You are the sneaky metallic rod that keeps this bodiless reaper of a channel aloft. I'm out of breath after reading all those names, so I don't have a clever quip for you. I guess we'll see you next time. Cheers.